pratite intervju s povodom. Naš gost je ambasador Sjedinjenih Američkih Država na Kosovu, Džefri Hovenijer. Ambassador, welcome.
Puno vam hvala. Thank you very much.
The American Embassy once again supported the coalition of independent media in the fight of fake news. You come, as far as I know, from the state of Washington and the city of Bellingham. Am I right?
That is right, yes.
So when you want to read news about your homeland from Kosovo, which media do you follow and what do you do personally to fight against fake news?
So first, I do come from what was a small town. It's now about 90,000 people, so it's grown a little bit in my lifetime. And I'm glad you asked me that question. I do read my local newspaper almost every day still. The Bellingham Herald, it's been around since the 1880s. They have a nice website. You have to pay a little bit per year to access all their stories, and it's one of my ways of staying connected with my community. There's also a local radio station, KGMI, that I listened to as a kid. One of the persons I grew up with is now one of their newscasters. So sometimes I'll listen to it just to hear my old friend speaking and telling me the local news. But you raise an important point, and that is the question of what news sources do you use and how can you be sure that the news you're getting is accurate? I have a lot of confidence in the Bellingham Herald and KGMI from my little town because they've been around a long time and they have high professional standards and they fact check. I think that's an important thing for all of us, to think about our sources of information and to make sure we're comfortable that what we're getting is accurate. The United States government has partnered here in Kosovo with a number of organizations, including Radio Kim and others, to help provide training and support. We're delighted over many years to see these organizations use this training and support to ensure they're providing fact-based information. One thing I would note, some of the most extreme cases of information come from social media, and they come from people we know. You'll be on Facebook or probably TikTok or Twitter or something else, and you'll see things, and without thinking, you might repost them or spread this. It's good to pause. It's good to take a look. Does this sound right? Is this right? Is this really setting me off? Is it a story that might have been written to set me off? Do I want to check? And there's ways to go do that. Here in Kosovo, there's an awful lot of very credible news sources as well. It's worth pausing for a minute and looking at that, just as it is in the States.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the agreement signed at the end of July with Millennium Challenge Corporation, will Kosovo ensure energy stability in a foreseeable future, and how much time is optimally needed to achieve this, according to what you know?
Well, that's a really hard question to answer. I can tell you that the Millennium Challenge Corporation's compact has a 5-year timeline, and that compact is designed to help the government of Kosovo transition its energy structure. Right now, as I'm sure you know, Kosovo is almost exclusively reliant on 2 dirty coal-burning power plants.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is not a 21st century source of power, and it's not a very reliable source of power for this country. We know that this year it is unlikely to be able to produce enough energy as will be required for the winter. Now, this is not a Kosovo problem. This is a European problem. The problem of reduced supply, increasing demand, and extremely high prices if you're going to import power, largely as a result of Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine and the impact that has had on the price of electricity, means a difficult winter here. We're committed to helping both the Millennium Challenge Corporation's compact. Like I said, over 5 years, we'll help it transition to something that has a diversity of supply, much better storage, regionalization, a more stable system. Our USAID team is also working on short and long-term things. But this winter's going to be tough, and so all of us probably have to think about conservation and trying to follow the guidance from the government of Kosovo to reduce how much power we use. And we're going to all need a little bit of patience.
Yeah, absolutely. Broadly speaking, agreement between Kosovo and the MCC could be placed in some points of Washington commitments. I mean, precisely point 8 and to some extent even point 7 signed by President Vučić and Prime Minister Hoti in front of President Trump in September 2020. So I'm interested if that commitment is still in force. That is, what does it present for the current U.S. administration?
No, it's an important question. So this administration early on took a look at the Washington commitments and made the determination that it still has valid status and that there were a number of commitments we would hope to see implemented. Some have been implemented. Some have been overtaken by events, and some we continue to work on together. More broadly, though, it's also our view that a number of existing commitments made or agreements reached, either under the Brussels process or in other ways, are still out there, and we look to both the government of Serbia and the government of Kosovo to fulfill commitments they've made.
So speaking of energy and the Washington commitment, I'm interested in what is going on with the preparation of a feasibility study on sharing of Lake Gazivod as a reliable supplier of not only energy but also water.
So that was one of the elements discussed in the Washington commitments. My understanding is shortly before I arrived, so a while ago now, we completed this feasibility study and gave it both to the government of Serbia and the government of Kosovo. And it is up to those two governments to decide what additional steps they want to take, if any. But they have the feasibility study.
Already at the beginning of the August, according to the reports from the official Belgrade, we had 13th attack this year on the facilities of Serbian Orthodox Church. So how do you see current position of the SPC and its believers in Kosovo? I ask you this also in context of Dečani Monastery situation with land.
It's such an important question. And the question of the Serbian Orthodox Church's place and role in Kosovan society is such an important issue. As you may know, I was part of the team that helped develop the Ahtisaari plan, and we were very focused on this at that time as well, and we remain focused. First, I want to say the United States, and I believe I can speak for our partners as well, feel very strongly that Kosovo must be a multi-ethnic state in which all citizens, without regard to ethnicity, are able to live in conditions of dignity and security. We also believe that as part of the Ahtisaari process and other things, we have commitments from the government of Kosovo with regard to the status of the church. Ahtisaari set the stage, and the government of Kosovo subsequently implemented legislation that is really quite strong with regard to protections, the legal framework and these special protective zones for the church and its status. We're concerned whenever there's an attack on any house of religion or any faith. You're right, there have been some particular ones of deep concern against the Serbian Orthodox Church, and we condemn those, and we talk to government authorities about their responsibility to ensure security for the church. The last thing I want to say, since you raised the Dečani Monastery land case, the United States doesn't have anything new to say here. I think we've been quite clear together with our Quint partners on this point, but we do believe this is a rule of law issue. It's that simple, and we believe there is a constitutional court decision. From our perspective, and as we've publicly called for in the past, it needs to be implemented. This isn't something to negotiate or at this point to discuss. That has happened, but the court has ruled, and in a democracy, you follow the decisions of a constitutional court.
Thank you very much. According to President Biden, corruption is a threat to U.S. national security. However, I hope that we can agree with the statement that this is a threat to every democratic society. You spoke at an event during the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between Kosovo municipalities and USAID regarding municipal integrity when it comes to public procurement. Is it the local and municipal level crucial to fight against corruption in societies like Kosovo?
Yes, of course it is. Now, the fight against corruption is multifaceted and multi-layered. But you know, I learned a few things about this after I arrived here as ambassador. So one fact, 40% of all of Kosovo's budget is spent in public procurement. That is a lot of money. A lot of that is done at the municipal level because that's where a lot of the procurements take place. So there's both the potential for corruption, but also it's very important for that process to be fair and transparent. We're delighted that the U.S. government is able to help a number of municipalities have a more transparent procurement system. More broadly, we're committed in a lot of different ways to help the people of Kosovo ensure or have a government that delivers services that are fair and that are free of corruption. And so we have a range of assistance programs under USAID helping establish good governance and helping ministries and functions of government be transparent and effective and responsive to citizens.
Speaking about corruption and crime, a whole series of so-called controversial Serbian businessmen from north of Kosovo, as well as some political leaders, also are on the blacklist of the U.S. Treasury Department because of they are labeled as members of corruption and organized crime networks. So what are your message to Srpska Lista and official Belgrade regarding this fact? And have you spoken with your colleague Christopher Hill about that?
So we U.S. ambassadors in the region talk together reasonably frequently about a range of issues, including issues associated with transnational organized crime, combating corruption, seeing implemented decisions by the Department of Treasury with regard to specific designations, imposition of sanctions on people. With regard to the broader sanctions designations, I want to be clear about a point. We don't do this lightly, and we don't do this capriciously. When the Treasury Department makes a designation and says a specific person is now subject to sanctions, in this region it means one of two things. That we either have very compelling evidence that person is linked to transnational organized crime, or that they've been involved very specifically in acts that would destabilize the region. Those are our sanctions authorities. It isn't just someone taking a piece of paper and writing a signature approving something. So if we've designated somebody, you can be confident we have very good evidence and very good reason to do so. Someone who is designated, someone who's been subject to sanctions, faces consequences, including any assets they hold that are in the United States are no longer available to them. We encourage people to think very carefully about the relationships they have with people that we have designated. We will not have relationships with people we have designated.
Thank you. Have you talked recently with Prime Minister Kurti or President Osmani about the return of Kosovo Serbs to the cities? And how is that except for the northern part of Kosovo, to some extent, the Serbian community lives almost exclusively in the villages of Kosovo, even though the conflicts ended almost a quarter or a century ago?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question and raised that issue. I can't speak to why individual people make their own individual choices, but I feel very, very strongly that individual people should and must have the right to make their own individual choices. We worked very hard at the time of independence, before and after, with authorities of Kosovo to ensure that there's a legal framework and a constitution that guarantees freedom of movement, that guarantees anyone who has the right, as I said earlier, to live. Everyone has the right to live in conditions of security and dignity without regard to ethnicity. So I've had this conversation, of course, with the current political leadership. I've also had it with the Minister of Returns and Economies, Goran Rakic, to talk about what are the impediments to return. I feel strongly that any individual from Kosovo with property in Kosovo who has a right to be in Kosovo has the right to reside in Kosovo wherever they want, and should be able to exercise that right without being afraid, without confronting problems. This is still hard, but it's a fundamental principle for us.
Okay, I would like to hear your comment on the current situation with the car registration and plates. According to the mayor of North Mitrovica, Milan Radović, during the first month of the deadline for re-registration, there was only one person submitted a request for that in the north of Kosovo. Will there be an extension of the deadline after the end of October? And what is your message to the authorities and to the people in this regard?
Yeah, I can't speak to exactly how many people have changed their license plates, but it's fairly clear that there's not been an overwhelming demand to do so thus far. I would say a few things, some of which we've said before. The United States government believes that the issue in and of itself and the decision by the government of Kosovo to have people who reside in Kosovo drive vehicles that are registered in Kosovo and that show license plates from Kosovo is not an unreasonable request, and that this decision itself is consistent with the Brussels agreements. We have, however, from the beginning expressed concerns, which we continue to express, with regard to the timeline for implementation. And since your question was what's my message to the government of Kosovo, my message to the government of Kosovo has been that we believe that more time is needed, that we are not enthused about a short timeline because this is difficult for people and it is hard. We hope that it will be extended. That's been part of our conversation. I can't speak to whether that will happen or not because you asked me what will happen, because that is a decision of the government of Kosovo.
Yeah, that's absolutely the decision of the government of Kosovo. But as you said, I also think that period is way too short in order to change something around 10,000 car plates.
Yeah, as I said, our belief is that there are both some practical, but also just even some psychological considerations that argue in favor of there being a longer period for implementation.
Yeah, thank you very much. And finally, one light from sports.
Okay.
So when will Seattle Supersonics return to the NBA? Do you remember former performances of Vladimir Radmanović and Predrag Drobnjak in that team?
You know, I love that you asked me this question. I am a Sonics fan. I have been. So one of my better sports memories as a kid was in 1979 when the Supersonics won the NBA championship against the Washington Bullets in 5 games. And it was especially sweet because we'd lost the NBA championship the previous year in '78, also against the Washington Bullets. We went to Game 7 and then lost. So I have been a Sonic. And if you're a kid who grew up in the Seattle area, we didn't have a lot of winning sports franchises at first. I mean, now my Mariners and Seahawks have done better, but back then there wasn't a lot. And the Sonics were the team that won an NBA championship. So I've been a Sonics fan for, well, as long as I've lived, until that horrible day in 2008 when they left Seattle abruptly and became the Oklahoma City Thunder. You can hear my enthusiasm for Oklahoma City. So I hope that we'll have Sonics again someday. And yes, I do remember those 2 players. In fact, Mr. Radmanović had a nickname of Brodvej Džou. There was a Seattle sportscaster who thought he looked like Joe Namath, an American football player. And so people had a hard time saying Radmanović, but they could say Brodvej Džou in Seattle. If we get a Sonics team again, and if we have more ethnic Serb players, I promise you I will pronounce their names correctly. And I look forward to cheering them on from the stands in Seattle.
Ambassador, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.